Okay, in this video I want to go over how to set up a layout, a gauge layout. Some people refer to it as a dashboard. Setting up gauges or a gauge panel on your device for logging purposes. But first I just want to touch on, go over something that I touched on briefly in an earlier video, and that is the user gauges. So if you go to the main menu of MPScandroid and click on Miscellaneous, and then click on User Gauges, you'll get this window. And in this window you can add gauges that you're going to alter. And the first one I'm going to add is this AFR 02 volts. And that is the RAM description for an item that is used for the wideband to narrowband conversion and then logging that 0 to 5 volts and then converting that 0 to 5 volts to an AFR reading. So in this case you see the short name has already been named as AFR wideband, and the information over on the left part, the ECU max and the ECU min are values that you need to change. So where do you get those values? Well, the default values that pulled up on here aren't correct for the device that I have in my car. I have an MTXL that's from Innovate, and if you look at the manufacturer specifications, 5 volts equates to 22.39. And the ECU minimum is 7.35. So I'm going to leave that. Now the display minimum is the minimum that's going to show up in your log. And I want my minimum, I just set my minimum to be exactly what the gauge range is. So I'm going to do 7.35. And the display maximum I'm going to put at 22.39. Now once you've got the settings altered, you want to come up here to the upper right hand corner, hit the menu, and save your user gauge settings. And this updates the user gauge file. Now the other gauge that I'm going to add for our test, because when I do this layout, I'm going to also add an analog input. Now the analog inputs, you'll only be able to have them functional with the MPSCI link. Right now, using MPScandroid with a USB on the go cable, you do not have that functionality. It does not read the analog input through the FTDI cable. So the way that this list is sorted when you want to add a gauge, the analog inputs are all the way at the bottom of the list. And for my purpose, I'm going to use analog port 4. So it's been added now, and you can see the analog port 4 has the units of voltage put in here. And also the short name is just A4. In the user gauge settings, it gives you an opportunity to rename. So I'm going to call this AFR wideband out. And that's just going to be my short name for AFR wideband output from my MTXL. Now the device, I want the gauge that I add to my layout to read in AFR. So I'm going to change that value to be units of AFR, and then the values are going to be just like the other row for this test, 7.35 and 22.39. And you have to change that on the ECU maximum as well. Once again, you need to save your settings. The other gauge that I'm going to change around here for you is the RPM. I'm going to add RPM, and I'm going to change it just so my gauge, when I add it, only goes to 7,000 instead of 8,000. I went right past it again. Actually, I think it said engine RPM, so it's these, by the time you use these tables, they might have been resorted. So that's one thing that's identified in a future update. So there's some discussion on which is the right RPM to add, but I know from previously logging that this one worked, so I'm just going to add that RPM 3D. And I'm going to change my display maximum only to 7,500. I think I'll pick 7,500 instead, just to illustrate the change. You don't want to change, in this instance, you just want to change how the gauge displays when you add it to your layout. So you don't want to change the ECU value, just what's being displayed. And then again, save. And I back out of this, and then I'm just going to pop back into user gauges and see that everything is still there the way we had set it. I think for this video I'm going to stop it here, and then I'll pick back up on creating a layout and adding gauges and making changes to gauges.